Okay, y'all, here we go. We're gonna start working through chapter 5, which is infancy. This is actually the second section of the chapter that starts with talking about the early foundations that you need for language development. So here we go. So this information is in your book, the Pence and Turnbull book, and it is the pages from starting with infant directed speech on page 135. So that's where we are. All right, so infant directed speech is what we use when we talk to the small people. It is under the broader umbrella of what's called child-directed speech, or CDS. So infant-directed speech is, as you might guess, speech that is directed at an infant. It's sometimes also called motherese or baby talk. And it's not as complex as child-directed speech. So it is not the same thing. It's distinguishable from child-directed speech because we talk differently to infants than we do to older children. So some of the paralinguistic features are a higher overall pitch, exaggerated pitch contours, a slower tempo. So when we talk to infants specifically, we'll look at them and we'll say things like, "Do you have a dirty diaper? Does Is your diaper wet? Let's take that diaper off." And the higher pitch, the exaggerated contours, slower tempo, all of those things are part of infant directed speech. Other characteristics of infant-directed speech are in the syntactic characteristics. So remember, in this book, we talk about form, content, and use across all of the chapters we've covered so far. So syntax is a part of form. It is how words are put together in sentences so that they make sense and they convey meaning properly. So the speech, infant-directed speech, is got a shorter MLU, or mean length of utterance. It has fewer subordinate clauses. It uses more content words. So function words are the grammatical glue of our speech. The auxiliary verbs, adverbs, articles like a and the, and are the articles, conjunctions, things like that. Content words are the words that really convey the meaning of what you're trying to say. So if I were to say, "Get ball now," you'd be able to figure out what I meant. I could say, and it would be more grammatically appropriate to say, "Get the red ball now," but you wouldn't necessarily need the function words in order to know which ball I needed you to get. Okay, so the discourse features of infant-directed speech, we use many more repetitions and we ask more questions, like in the example I just used with, "Are you wet? Is the baby wet? Do you need a new diaper?" Things like that. Bunches of questions. Wet, diaper, oh my goodness, let's get that wet diaper off of you. Things like that. Um, all of these paralinguistic features and syntactic characteristics and discourse features draw the infant's attention to us, and they prefer it to adult-directed speech. Like if I were, let's say, talking to my partner or to another mom that's in the room, I would be talking in a similar way to how I'm talking to you right now. So not particularly exaggerated, definitely not short MLU. And I'm using all of the grammatical pieces and parts that have really low inflection in sentences, etc. And I'm not working real hard to keep your attention. Whereas if I were talking to an infant, I would be doing all of those things. All right, so one of the other things that research has indicated is that the exaggerated vowels that we use in infant-directed speech, like wet and are you wet? Y'all are gonna just really enjoy this video, I can tell. Help, but all of these things, like, yeah, that's what you were thinking, help. All of these things help infants maintain attention. It gets their attention, and it makes it easier for them to process the words. Again, infant-directed speech highlights content words. It highlights articles like a new diaper. We need a new diaper, that kind of stuff. We put them in exaggerated pitch peaks. We put them at the ends of utterances, and it isolates them from other words in the utterance so that the infant's attention is drawn to those words because they're getting the most inflection. We exaggerate pauses in infant-directed speech, and which helps babies try to figure out where the junctions are between words and between utterances. And that's one of the ways that infants are able to isolate individual words for word learning. So joint attention is truly one of the penultimate foundational skills in infancy that drives language learning forward. We use joint reference and joint attention, and there are 3 phases to this process. And your book actually does a really great job talking about these phases on page 137. There's a really excellent figure. It's figure 5.4, and it talks about each of the individual phases. So phase 1 is when infants learn to attend to their social partners. So you can see in the picture to the right that the infant has raised its head, let's say there, because babies aren't its, has raised their head and is looking at the caregiver. And that is joint attention. They are looking at each other. They are sharing each other's attention. And that emerges as early as birth and is really getting honed in up to the 6-month period. So the emergence in coordination of joint attention happens usually around 6 months. So around 6 months, babies will actually offer an object to an interactional partner. They'll hold something out for their partner to look at. And they continue to do this and really start to engage in both initiating joint attention and responding to joint attention by looking at the eye line of their interactional partner and things like that. So some of that's called supported joint engagement, where adults will use like a really animated voice and show the baby new things, and that's supported joint attention, and that's usually adult directed. But caregivers will really try to maintain their infant's attention, and the more they do that, it actually is facilitative of the child's attentional skills, their ability to sustain attention later in life. So around 1 year is when babies make the transition to language. And by that, it means that they're really starting to use true words where they are, they understand that objects, they've got object permanence, so they know that things still exist even when they can't see them. They have means end, so they know that if they do something, if they do X behavior, then Y happens, like pushing a car, throwing a ball, or screaming, or flinging spaghetti, or whatever else. So they've learned how to manipulate their environment, and they have really gotten good at isolating words in the auditory stream. Okay, so part of joint attention is really focusing on attending to your social partner. Um, Babies love interaction, and they love to engage in interpersonal interactions with the other people in their environment. So remember from your child development class that in infancy, babies come into the world without their visual acuity being intact, like completely intact. So infants tend to only, like newborn infants, can only see something like less than a foot away from their faces, which makes it, which in some ways, it pre-wires them to attending to faces, because when you're feeding a baby, whether you're breastfeeding or bottle feeding, the way we tend to hold newborns and infants as we feed them with either breast or bottle is we have them within a foot of our faces. So we kind of come into the world wired to really attend to faces. So infants will learn to engage in rituals and move their bodies in order to get into a position to have joint attention with other people. Like turning their heads to be able to look into the face of the person who is feeding them. Um, and infants will react both positively and negatively to the emotional support that they are provided in their environment. So I remember when my oldest daughter was an infant, I was writing my dissertation, and she was prone to ear infections, and so I would try to write my dissertation between about 9 and midnight, or until I just couldn't see straight anymore. And she would wake up and because her ears hurt. And so I would go into her room, and sometimes I would try to nurse her, but if her ear was really hurt, bothering her, she would not be about that. And I found one night, like as I was rocking her and patting her back, ostensibly to soothe her, that I was actually patting her really hard. I um, and I had to really think to myself, I really kind of developed a mantra that as I rocked, I would just say over and over to myself, there is nowhere more important I need to be. There's nowhere more important I need to be. And as my heart rate would come down and I would start to relax, she would start to relax too. So infants are very attuned to the tension and heart rate of the people holding them. All right. So as time goes on, coordinating joint attention, which is a phase 2 activity, um, gets better and better. And this goes back to what we talked about, or what I mentioned previously, is that children who engage in longer periods of joint attention actually have been found to have larger vocabularies at 18 months. And I just talked about how infants I talked about supported joint engagement, and adults speaking with animated voices. And one thing I didn't mention previously is that when adults are constantly redirecting an infant's attention, so let's say an infant is intently looking at a toy and an adult tries to distract them with a different toy and then a different toy or whatever, it's actually works against the baby's ability to learn sustained attention. All right, moving right along. All right, so one of the things, and this is actually a really great picture, where um, there is a term called intersubjective awareness, where the infant starts to realize that somebody else is looking at and doing, or is interested in what they're doing. So in the particular picture to the right, you can see that the baby's looking in the box and reaching into the box and has taken out the ball and is in one hand and is still looking in there. And now in the final picture has actually looked up and has alternated their eye gaze between the object and the person who is taking the pictures, which we're going to call the communicative partner. And it's a really cool developmental milestone for them to realize that, hey, you're looking at the same thing that I'm looking at, and whoa, we could look at it together and talk about it. And it is one of the foundational things for turn taking and for word learning, because let's picture the possible information being given here. So let's say in the first picture, the caregiver says, "What's in the box?" And so the baby's reaching in there, the baby's looking in the box, and maybe the caregiver goes, "Is there a phone in the box?" And the baby pulls the box over, see in like picture 3, and um, and is looking at it. I'm going to use my little laser pointer thing. Uh, so now the baby's like, "Whoa, look at that." And then the baby, and maybe the caregiver says again, "Is there a phone in the box?" And the baby pulls out the phone and looks triumphantly at their caregiver like, "Aha, indeed, there is a phone in the box." So there you go. So now they've used a bit of a ritual to figure out what's being talked about and and maybe if there hadn't been one in there, the baby would have looked back at the caregiver with a different expression, things like that. All right, so I thought this was pretty funny. So intentional communication is when infants really start to use their communicative skills, like showing an object or throwing an object, or vocalizing to get the attention of an interactional partner on purpose to see if they can engage in turn taking. So that starts to emerge around 8 to 10 months and is a pretty obvious precursor um, to first words. All right, so the infants will start to use what's called imperative pointing around 10 months old. And it's what they use when they need the adults in their environments basically to step and fetch. Declarative pointing, on the other hand, is more of a social process where they're like, hey, kind of like, they will use that declarative pointing to say, hey, look at that. And whoa, it's a ball, or get me that thing. So one of the important things to remember is that kids produce, or children produce and understand declarative pointing or the social pointing before they understand imperative pointing, which is the hey, go get me that. So between 6 months and 1 year, we know that infants actually demonstrate sensitivity to and can identify the emotions of others. So are they looking at you and going, oh, she is so anxious? No, but if you look upset, then they're going to look upset. So think about the toddler, so a 6 month to 1 year old. So we've got little people now who are crawling and on the verge of walking. And let's say they fall, and then they look at you to see if you're like, oh my God, are you okay? And if you just look really neutral, or you look happy, like, yeah, you're all right, then they don't cry. If you look alarmed, then they start to cry. And that starts to happen between 6 months and 1 year old. All right. So now we're getting to this 1 year old phase, and which is phase 3 in the phases of joint attention. And and toddlers are starting to actually use language, like meaningful words, to communicate with other people. They're using language to represent events and objects. My son, when actually he still has it, but he was given a little stuffed dog with blue ears. And early on, he would say, I would show it to him and use my motherese and go, you want your puppy? Your puppy's so soft, and things like that. And so he would use his declarative pointing, and it became to call my attention to his puppy. And then as he got a little bit better, his imperative pointing to, but he would always say babu. So the the name for that stuffed animal became Babu, even though, and that's using language to represent events and objects. And even though it wasn't an adult form, even close to puppy, he consistently used it to request that particular object. And that's called a phonetically consistent form, which is something we'll talk about again. So mothers, caregivers, verbal encouragement of infants is related to positive language development. The more responsive we are to the sounds and attention of infants, and the more infant-directed speech that caregivers engage in, the easier it is for infants to learn language, because we are consistent with the kinds of things that, the words that we are giving to them. So a really important piece of this too is routines. So in infancy, because infants are really completely dependent on caregivers to keep them alive, we have lots of daily routines, and their routines revolve around I used to always say input and output. So either you're changing diapers, which is output, or you're feeding them, which is input. And in dressing and things like that. Either you're putting them into clothes, or you're pulling them out of clothes, or you're putting them into the bathtub, or you're taking them out of the bathtub. And the great thing about that is that in routines, we use those same words over and over. Are you wet? Oh my goodness, you're wet. Or stinky, or whatever it is that you're using. And we use those same phrases over and over and over again. And that's how infants start to parse out single words from the word soup that's flying by them all the time. Routines also allow for joint attention. We are looking at the same thing. We are engaged in the same activity, especially feeding activities. Okay, so caregiver responsiveness is huge for development. It is the cornerstone um, of letting infants know that this sound coming out of our faces is something worth paying attention to. So there are 7 characteristics of caregiver responsiveness. I'm not going to go through an explanation of every single one of them. If you really need me to, put it in the comments under the video, but you can find the full explanation on page 141 in your text. All right, so that's chapter 5, page 141 gives you the full explanation of waiting and listening, following the child's lead, joining in and playing, being face-to-face, varieties of questions and labels, encouraging turn taking, and expanding and extending. So that's it for this section. I'm going to try to get it posted. Hopefully it works for you. Later.